This is a demo of the ITInsight application that I put together to give us some visibility into the various assets that make up our IT portfolio and the interdependencies or relationships between those assets. It was also put together to help answer most, if not all, of those not so easy to answer questions that I talked about in my previous presentation. I'm going to demo the app for you today, and as I go through it, I'll point out where some of those challenging questions are answered and how they're answered to tie this back to what I spoke about earlier. The first thing I'd like to do is to just talk about the UI and the panes that make up this UI. So starting up here at the top, this horizontal pane is the list of the filtering criteria that will allow us to filter the perspective and the view that we want to have on the assets that make up our portfolio. And as we go through this, I'll talk about each of the attributes here. When we render a graph and we render the assets that we want to view, they will be rendered and their relationships will be rendered over here in this pane over here on the right. Details about that graph will be displayed down here as to the number of assets that are displayed and the number of interdependencies between them. And if I select any asset over here, the details, the metadata about those assets, that will be displayed over here. And you'll see that as we go along. Up here within the filters list is the set of asset types. And if I drop this down, it'll show you the current set of asset types we have. And this is all completely extensible within the database. But to talk about them, an application is a UI-based software asset that users log into. And you'll see why that's important as I go through this list. Cloud are cloud services that are provided by third party that are running outside of our ownership that we interface with. Databases are pretty self-explanatory. Our ESB is our asynchronous integration product platform. Partners are third-party entities that we exchange data with, but that are not service-based. So we might send them files, we might receive files from them. Platform is a term that I use to cover a software platform that provides a list of services. Right? Our Doc repository is one such platform. Our BPM platform is another one. Our ESB is another platform. Servers are the list of servers that make up our portfolio on which all of our apps and services run. A service is a software asset that does not have a UI, that cannot be called by a user directly, but is called by some other piece of software, either an application or another service. A stored procedure is a service essentially that is hosted within the database. And a widget, this is a UI-based software asset that users are able to view, but they cannot view them directly via URL. They are only viewable in the context of another application. So they would be brought up when a user accesses an application. They may have a link in there to pull up a widget, but that widget is not directly accessible. Next to that is a drop-down of all of the assets that I've got defined in here currently. And this is all dummy data that's in here for demonstration purposes. Right now, by dropping this down, let's go back to all. If I drop this down, this is all of the assets that make up our portfolio. If I were to choose a specific asset type in here, say application, this will show me only the UI-based applications that make up the portfolio. If I were to switch that to server, it will show me only the servers that make up our portfolio, and I could choose one of those servers to render. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Over here at the right, there's a reset filters button, which will set everything back to their default, which I'll do. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to bring up one of our assets. Let's come down here and let's choose the BPM credit flow. And I'm not going to change any of the other attributes at the moment, and I'm going to hit render. If you remember from the earlier presentation, there are three components to this application. What you're looking at is the UI, the ITInsight UI component. This component just made a call when I clicked render. It made a call back to the ITInsight API component, REST API, which in turn pulled data from the ITInsight database module, the graph database, pulled that data back, sent it back through the API back to the UI, and has now been rendered. And what you'll see here is that it's showing, because I chose to display the BPM credit flow, it's showing me that as the quote-unquote center of the universe, and all of the integrations within our portfolio with that credit flow. You'll see there are a lot of arrows going out, some arrows going in. What that represents is the interdependencies. So in this case, this ESB service, the Send Credit App to BPM ESB service, is upstream from the credit flow. It is the caller of the BPM credit flow service. The rest of these, because the arrows go out, are services or asynchronous integrations that are invoked from the credit flow. I'll point out here that the icons represent the type of asset it is, and I'll point these out as we go through. The gears represent a service, and this represents a queue or an asynchronous list of messages to be processed. So if you think about going back to the not so easy questions to answer, I mentioned one of the fundamental questions that any app owner needs to be able to understand and be able to answer is, what services does my particular application or service depend upon and invoke, and thus downstream, as well as what services or applications are upstream from my service that call me. This is one way of rendering that. Another way to do that is I provided a checkbox here for hierarchical, which is an indication to say, you know what, this is a relationship representation, but I'd like to render that hierarchically. And I can do that, and I can zoom in. Sorry, I don't have my mouse, I'm doing it with a touchpad. And by doing that and looking at the credit flow, what I see here, it's now hierarchical, right? The calling apps, the upstream apps are on the left. The calls flow down to the credit flow, and then all the calls that the credit flow make flow out to the right. So that answers those first two questions. It also tells us the dependencies that say, if I were to make a modification to this flow and redeploy a new version, or potentially replace it with a new implementation on a different platform, what's the impact of that? If all I'm doing is changing code, I know that I need to test it from this upstream service and make sure that everything downstream continues to work as it did. If I replace it, it shows me the universe of, or the collection of applications and services that need to be tested as part of that change to make sure that I have not broken anything. One other thing to display here is, or to demonstrate, is that I have the ability to drill up and drill down into different assets directly from the diagram. So let's say I wanted to look at the deal repository service, this service over here. I can click it, and that will refresh the asset details page over here, and I'll talk about these in a minute. But I can also double click on this, and that reruns the query, replacing the asset that I was looking at with the asset that I double clicked on, and shows me its relationships with other assets. We're seeing a few different icons here, so I'll just quickly point those out. This is an application. So this Lease Management System 2 is an application icon, and these are widget icons. They represent just a window that's displayed within another application. To go back to the credit flow, I can double click on this, and that will bring me back to the credit flow. Going back over here before I make any changes, I wanted to come over here and just talk about the asset details pane a little bit. Depending upon the asset that's selected, there are details, a custom list of details shown over here based upon the asset type. In this case, because I've selected a service, I can see its name, the fact that it is a service, a description for that service, and again, this is dummy data, that's why it's not very descriptive, the owner of that service, and the idea behind this is that it's important to understand who to contact if you have a question or want to know more about or have an issue with and need to talk to someone. I've provided some URLs. There's one for each environment, as well as the one here in the middle, which is the docs URL. And that would be the URL to the repository or the website, like the Confluence site, where the documentation for a particular service or application can be found. So that if I'm new to the organization and I want to learn about the credit flow, clicking that link would take me to that repository so that I can begin reading up on what the credit flow is, how it works, what its purpose is, and so on. Anything that I don't glean from this cursory set of overview data here. The last thing to talk about is tags. In this case, I have the credit flow selected, and you'll see that it's tagged as BPM, so any asset that's BPM related would be tagged BPM. Because it's part of the originations process, it is tagged as originations. And then we also have a CloudWave tag on here, which I'll talk about towards the end of the presentation, and I'll give you details on that later. If I were to check to select a different entity, like the AML service in this case, you'll see that it also is originations. It's part of a different CloudWave, and it's part of our core services. So that's what tags is all about. Okay, one other thing to talk about up here from a filter perspective is this depth field. Right now, we are showing a depth of 1, and what that represents is a degree of separation between the entity that I care about, in this case the BPM credit flow, and its relationships with other assets. There's 1 degree of separation. If I were to bump this up to 2 degrees of separation and re-render this, what you'll see is that it re-renders the graph, and it's showing the same data, right, this core set of data and the relationships of the BPM credit flow, but it's gone 1 step further and also rendered not only who the callers are of the credit flow and the services that the credit flow calls, but who calls those services and what services do those services call, right? So it's 2 degrees of separation from the credit flow. So over here is an example. The credit flow invokes the customer exposure service, but that customer exposure service invokes 2 different stored procs out here in the database, and that's what this icon represents. It represents the stored proc. In this case, the decision path service invokes the decision service, and so on. The credit flow invokes the legal name verification service, which invokes a cloud-based service to do that name verification. So that allows us to get to any degree of separation. If I were to bump this up to 3, it's obviously going to get more and more complicated as we go, and more assets are going to be displayed. So now this is 3 degrees of separation from the credit flow within our portfolio. I'm going to go back to 1 and render 1. As we've talked about looking here at the credit flow, the arrows going in and out represent upstream and downstream. Looking at this dependencies filter, I have it set to both, and both means that I want to see both upstream and downstream. I can also filter to say, you know what, only show me the downstream, or only show me the upstream, in which case it will only show me those. So just really quickly, if I chose upstream, there's only 1 upstream, so this is going to change the rendering dramatically, right? Showing me that this is the only upstream caller of the BPM credit flow. Likewise, if I chose downstream and rendered that, it would render all the downstream services, and you'll see there's no arrows going into the credit flow. The next dependency type is infrastructure. And what this is going to do is, if you look at these are all software-based integrations. By choosing infrastructure and rendering it, what this is going to do is this is going to show me for the credit flow what are the infrastructure assets that relate to the credit flow. In this case, there's a set of servers that it runs on, and that's what each of these icons represent. The servers that run this. And you may be wondering why there's so many, and that's because there are many different environments, right? If I choose this server, this shows me that this is the DR environment. If I were to pick this server, this is one of the servers out of the production environment. So that's why there are multiple servers shown. I only have 1 database shown here, and that's the production database. It's just because of the subset of data and the test data that I have in here. But this represents the database behind the credit flow, and in this case, it's the production database that it accesses. This icon over here represents the BPM platform, and this shows the fact that the credit flow runs on the BPM platform. In fact, if I were to double click on this and bring up the platform details, this shows me all of the BPM flows that run on the BPM platform. The credit flow is one of them over here, but there are a handful of others that run on that platform as well. So I can drill up to the platform, I can drill down into the individual, in this case the BPM flows themselves. There's another field up here called Add to Graph, and that's what I want to demonstrate next. So if I drop this down, I'm going to choose the BPM drawdown flow, which is just another hypothetical flow. And if I were to just hit render now, this graph would be replaced with a similar graph for the drawdown flow. But I don't want to lose what I have here. So I provided the ability to just add it to the graph. And when I hit render, it's now going to render both the drawdown flow and the credit flow and the service that each of them are dependent upon. And as it redraws itself, what you'll notice here is that there are some affinities between these two flows. And there's a set of services here in the middle that are shared and are called by both of those two flows. But there are services that are invoked uniquely by each one. So that's what adding to graph does. It allows me to add to the graph as I choose to, instead of replacing what is already there. Let's go back to the credit flow, but I want to show the infrastructure one more time. Because thinking about the not so easy questions to answer are things like the dependencies on the databases. All right? So here is a database and here is a server. So we may want to know what runs on a particular server, or what runs on or what applications or services access a particular database. I can go up here and I can do the same thing. I can filter up here and I can choose the fact that I want to look at databases, or I want to look at servers and choose appropriate database or server. Or I can do this. If I click on this database, it now shows up and it renders for me the fact that this database is used by each of these flows. It's actually the production database used by all of them. So one of those difficult questions was, what applications reference a particular database? That's how we can see that information. If I go back here to the credit flow, switch back to infrastructure, render, and pick a server as an example. Let's pick the server. If I double click on the server, similarly, that's going to show me that what runs on this server, again, are each of these credit flows. So looking again back at some of those not so easy questions to answer, we can see what applications are running on each server and what servers does any particular application run on. The last of these dependency diagrams is labeled none. And to demonstrate what that does, I'm going to clear out the asset and I'm going to come over here to asset types and I'm going to choose cloud. And when I hit render here, what it's saying is saying, show me all the third-party cloud services, but I don't want to see any interdependencies between them. And by clicking render, that's exactly what's brought up. It shows me each of those third-party services. Now, one of the challenging questions that we had, that we talked about earlier, was, how do I know who the callers of these services are, so that I know what those interdependencies are? Well, that's easy to answer, because I can just say, you know what, show me the upstream services or applications that invoke those cloud service, re-render, and that is what I'm shown here. So this has taken me up 1 degree of separation, because that's what I chose as the depth, to say show me who all the callers are of each of these cloud services. So you can see here that the UCC doc service is called by the BPM UCC service and the BPM UCC flow as an example. Okay, so next I want to talk about tags. So let's reset the filters. And if you remember when I talked about tags earlier, I talked about the fact that they are dynamic attributes that we can add to any asset. If I drop this down, this is a list of all the tags across the entire portfolio that currently exists. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose Canada. And by choosing Canada, what that's saying is when I hit render, it's going to say show me all of the assets. You notice that I don't have anything specific shown here that are related to Canada. If I were to choose none here, it would just show me those assets, but I'm going to leave it as both so that we can see the interdependencies between them as well. When I hit render, and that's what we see here. So these are all of the Canadian-based, or the assets that support our Canada business, let's say, for example. If I come up here and I say, you know what, I want to see not just everything that's Canada, but those things within the Canada portfolio that are related to originations. And I hit render. So it's now, as expected, a smaller subset because it's only those assets that have to do with Canada and support the Canadian originations process. So going back to some of those questions that were not so easy to answer, if you remember, I talked about how do we identify assets that pertain to specific business verticals. And this is how we can identify that, by using these tags to say all those that pertain to Canada, and I've even narrowed it down further, saying all of those that are originations related. One other thing we can do is I can remove one of these tags. So some of these origination services are used, like the E-rate service, and I'm sure that the BPM credit flow, right? That's one example that we saw before, is not only used by Canada, but it is used by others as well. So if I render now, I'm going to get a much greater set of assets and a much bigger diagram. And as it, let me try and zoom out here a little bit, as it orients itself, this is all of the assets across both Canada and US and all the other business verticals that have anything to do with originations and their various types. And this gets to some of those other challenging questions that we talked about, which are, what are the affinities between assets? Where are the high number of dependencies that might make it difficult to migrate certain assets to the cloud? Or what things need to go together? So by looking at this, we can see that there's some high affinities here. Let's see what this is. That's Siebel origination. So our Siebel application has a very large number of integrations as part of the originations process. It's probably going to make it a complicated app to A, change or modify. But if when we were looking to modify it or migrate it to the cloud, let's say, or replace it with another solution, there's a lot of complexity there. Other ones, if I come up here and I choose this one, let's see what this is. This is the portfolio management application that has a lot of dependencies. There's a service down here that looks like it's highly, oh, there's the credit flow. So you can see by zooming out and by showing a large set of assets where those affinities exist that potentially should be migrated to the cloud together, if that's what you're doing, or where if you're making changes, the complexity will lie in testing. All right, the next thing I want to show, I'm going to reset my filters here. I'm going to choose a simple service that we have. Let's choose the AML service, just to keep the diagram simple so we can look at it easy. And you'll see that the AML service is one of those services called by the BPM credit flow. One of the capabilities I put in here is to make it very easy to update and modify the content of the repository. So by clicking on the edit button, it opens up these set of attributes. If I have nothing selected, I can add an asset or add an integration. If I have an asset selected, I can delete the asset or edit that asset. So first of all, let's add an asset. I can click anywhere in here and I can say, you know what? I'm going to create a new application. I'm going to call it My New App. My New App. Description. And it's owned by Dave. I'm not going to, the URLs are optional, so I'm not going to fill any of those in. But I can now come back down here, just like we talked about tags up here. I can come down here and I can choose the tags that I want this to be part of. Let's say that I want it to be, it is going to be a Canadian app, and it is part of the decisioning set of applications. And I can hit save, and that has now created my new application. You can see the details listed over here. If I want, I can add an integration, because right now it's not integrated, it has no relationships with anything. So I can say, you know what, let's assume that this app invokes the BPM credit flow. So from within here, I can add an integration, and I can say that it invokes that service, and click Save. So now I've added a new asset, a new application specifically, to our portfolio, and I've indicated the fact that it invokes the BPM credit flow. So if I were to bring up the BPM credit flow like we did before, everything is here, except we'll see that My New App is here as well. And instead of having one arrow going in as an invocation of this credit flow, we have two. And like before, if I were to render this hierarchically, you'll see that there are two upstream callers of the credit flow because I just added my new app to that. Let's go back to this view. Zoom in here a little bit. Wow, it's crazy. Sorry, I don't have a mouse. I'm using my touchpad, so it's a little crazy. I'm going to come over here, and from an edit perspective, we also have the ability to remove things. So if I chose to, I could remove this specific integration. If I did it incorrectly and wanted it connected to the AML service as an example, I could delete that and say, you know what, I didn't mean for it to invoke the credit flow. I meant that it should invoke the AML service. All right, and now I've made that change. Or I have the ability to delete the asset altogether. In this case, by deleting this asset, I'm also going to delete any relationships or integrations that it has with anything else. So that shows the capability of being able to dynamically and in real time update the inventory, the set of assets, and their relationships. The last thing that I want to show is, let me recenter this, bring this up, is a feature that I added in that is a rudimentary, and I'll emphasize rudimentary, rule engine. All right. And the reason for this, creating this, going back to what we talked about before, I mentioned these cloud wave tags. And if you remember, one of the challenges that I laid out in my earlier presentation, it was identifying what are the simplest or most complicated applications to migrate to the cloud. We saw that based upon the affinities that we saw before. But we also wanted to look at and say, well, what if we wanted to migrate to the cloud in waves rather than one service or application at a time? Let's define some waves for that. So if I come up here to the tags, you'll see that we've got a set of tags, wave 1A, 1B, 1C, 2A, 2B, and 2C. 1A would be the simplest assets to migrate to the cloud, and Cloud Wave 3 would be the most complicated. Looking at the BPM credit flow, you'll see here, like I showed before, it's assigned, or we assigned it a Cloud Wave 2B, right, as to go in 2B. So I could go through my list of assets and I can see which tags and which wave they belong to. But one of the things and one of the challenges that we wanted to make sure we addressed is identifying whether we have a scenario where we're migrating one service to the cloud before all of its dependencies have been migrated. So to handle that, I implemented this rudimentary rules engine. And the way this works is I can create here, I can define new ones, but I've got two predefined. One is a Cloud Wave rule. And it's a custom set of JSON that I define that allows me to define how this diagram is going to be rendered and what to apply to it. So in this case, it's saying that when you render a diagram, if the tags attribute over here has a value in it of Cloud Wave 1A, highlight that asset in red. That's the hex value for red. If it's in Cloud Wave 1B, highlight it orange. If it's in 1C, highlight it yellow. If it's 2E, highlight it green. If it's 2B, highlight it blue, and so on. By choosing this rule set and applying this rule set, what's going to happen is it's going to re-render the diagram, applying that set of rules. And if I bring this up here, you'll see that not every asset has a Cloud Wave associated with it, and that's just because it's test data. But for those that do, they have been highlighted, and I know it's not intuitive necessarily, and it's rudimentary, but it highlights those waves. So everything that is red, highlighted in red, is scheduled to go, it would be scheduled to go in Cloud Wave 1A. Everything that's orange would go in 1B. Everything that's yellow would go in 1C. There's no green, which would be 2A, but blue, which the credit flow is scheduled to go in Wave 2B, as would these other entities that are also blue. What's important to note here is that there is a purple one down here. And if I choose the in-flight exposure, you'll see that that service is scheduled to go in Wave 3. So what this identifies for us is the fact that we've got scheduled something to go in Wave 2B that would migrate to the cloud before all of its dependencies are migrated. And what that would mean is we'd have to have reverse connectivity from the cloud back to our on-prem applications in order for it to invoke this service, or change the order and the sequence in which things are migrated so that all the dependencies are migrated first. I can also come back up here and I can say, all right, I want to apply the no highlight rule, and that will remove all the highlights, which is what we've been looking at all along. And you can define and create rules on the fly within there to highlight things however you wish based upon whatever tags you wish to highlight it on. So this demonstrates what I put together in ITInsight, and it's my view on how we can get better visibility into our inventory of software assets, but will also give us the ability to answer some of those questions that I talked about throughout the presentation that are not so easy to answer, that ITInsight can help fill that gap. So thanks, I hope you found it interesting, and it demonstrates some of the vision that I've had for how we can improve how things work. So thanks so much for watching.